Hello everyone, this is Ketchy1383 with part 2 of my Saints Row Reboot review / commentary. This time around I'll be covering the gameplay after the disappointing story. And I wish I could say that the gameplay more than made up for the disappointing story. I mean, the previous Saints Row stories weren't exactly magnum opuses or some other great work of literacy or movies, but they were entertaining to say the least. And they had some really good gameplay. That's why they had sequels, is because the games were fun. The unfortunate part about rebooting a game is it still has some of the same issues as a sequel to a game. What I mean by that is that sequels have an expectation to be as good, if not slightly better, than the game that came before it. Being good, but being distinctly different enough to not warrant just playing the exact same game over again. A good example are the Tomb Raider reboots. Distinctly different from the 90s Tomb Raiders that you had on the PlayStation. While the reboots, the sequels were very much the same as the reboot. Even the plot points. I mean, the only difference was the settings. I mean, the settings of where the story took place. Otherwise, there was no distinction between the first and the second one as far as I was concerned. But we're talking about Saints Row here. So there is going to be an expectation in terms of what we're going to want from this game. And I was eager to find out how they were going to handle it when comparing gameplay from previous Saints Row. Were they going to go all ham like they did with Saints Row 4, or is it going to go back to more of a Saints Row 3 or even 2? So with that said, let's just address the elephant in the room. This game is definitely buggy. Some people are comparing it to Cyberpunk. In my experience, yes, they were both buggy, but not nearly to the degree that people were expressing. And what I've heard from other people in terms of Cyberpunk's bugs, it was far worse on lower end hardware with, say, the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox Series X. It's just unplayable. My PC was pretty decent, so I didn't have any real issues. I found a thing or two. I think the police AI didn't work for everyone, so I guess that counts. But in terms of Saints Row, definitely wish I was recording more, because I did experience a great deal of bugs, and there's some things I kind of question if they are or not. Let me give an example. So at one point, you can wingsuit off the top of a car. I go 6 feet, go head first into a stoplight, and instantly die. I can fly from the top of a building, crash into the concrete head first, and be perfectly fine. And I sort of wondering if that was a glitch or not, with me instantly dying from hitting a stoplight. The one that I did notice a lot was that certain vehicles would easily be flung up into the air regardless of how big they were. I was in a tank, and a little tiny 4-door sedan sent my tank flying 20 feet up into the air. Pretty sure that's not supposed to happen, but it did. Anyways, let's get past the bugs. Yes, it's buggy, and it was a complete and total shame that it was as buggy as it was, due to the fact that they delayed this game, and they still did not fix it, and I'm kind of wondering if they are going to. And considering the state of Saints Row 4 re-elected, I'm kind of guessing probably not. Which unfortunately does detract from the game. So, with that said, let me get into my main sort of focus here. The game is definitely, in terms of its engine, feels most like Saints Row the 4th. From the way the vehicles spawn in to the way it handles. Even the pace at which guns shoot feels very much like it came out of Saints Row 4. And I was playing Saints Row 4, and I was looking at the gun skins, and I will show you. Basically, the gun skins that were just skins for all the guns, obviously, became weapons in Saints Row Reboot. I mean, there's the Tommy gun, there's the pistol, the revolver pistol. I mean, in some cases, it was just like a cut and paste job of the same textures and weapons into the Reboot. And then they just expanded it. Instead of making skins for them, they turned the skins into weapons. And they probably borrowed parts of Saints Row 3. Like I mentioned before, Marshall is pretty much a clone of Stag, even down to their vehicles. Yes, there's some differences between the tanks, but if you look at them close enough, they're very similar. So unfortunately, when it comes to the combat in this game, which I'll focus on right now, is that it's not as good in previous iterations of Saints Row. I mean, melee attacking was actually just a pain in the butt in Saints Row 2, but in Saints Row 3 and Saints Row 4, it was pretty good. Considering you're supposed to be focusing more on shooting than you are supposed to be melee attacking, but they added a function to it. The melee attacking is just the worst. Whether you have weapons or not, it is just absolutely terrible. And I'll expand upon that when I cover some of the businesses in the game. The melee attacks complemented the shooting in previous Saints Row games. It was never supposed to be your main source of damage, but they were at least usable. In this, the enemies dodge. It doesn't do that much damage. And when I say dodge, they really don't dodge. They just sort of... I don't think they're actively dodging you because you're melee attacking. It's just the way the AI moves. You miss constantly. It's not fluid whatsoever. And it's pretty much pointless to melee attack at all in this game versus, let's say, in Saints Row 3 or 4, where you'll pull off some fancy maneuver and get an attack. Outside of using it for events in the game or missions, I would not use melee attacks unless it was required to, for whatever reason, to maybe get the best score I could. They were just that bad. I didn't even use melee weapons of any kind. The only time I ever used them was to complete challenges. Now, when it comes to shooting, they sort of went a direction of Red Dead Redemption 2, which is kind of a problem because it wasn't nearly as competently done as Red Dead Redemption 2. So when you aim down sights, you pop to a target. Unfortunately, it doesn't always put said target in the middle of the crosshairs. Most of the time it does. But let's say they duck. For whatever reason, if you're holding that trigger, it will pull the crosshairs up to where the torso should be, and you'll just shoot over their head. And when you try to lower the crosshairs, it keeps pulling them back up. On top of that, the auto aim is extremely heavy in this game. And sometimes it has you target targets that you don't want to be targeting. Sometimes you want to target someone in the back. If somebody's up front, doesn't care. It'll move the crosshairs to the said enemy. The other problem that I have is that when you compare it to, let's say, Saints Row 2 or 3, where there's definitely some auto-aiming, it's not nearly as prevalent, and it was a lot smoother when it came to aiming and shooting versus Saints Row Reboot. Eventually you get used to it, but it does become a big problem when you're in large groups of enemies, and I'll explain why later. Now, for character movement, it's basically that of Saints Row 3 and 4. It's pretty good. There's no real issue with them glitching as far as I could tell in terms of their animations or anything like that. It operates pretty smoothly. And when you steal vehicles, you still have the Saints Row 3 and 4 animations of you going through the windshield and stealing the car that way versus what they do in, let's say, Grand Theft Auto or Saints Row 2, where you sort of just walk up and pull the people out. That little bit of flair, not only is it practical for getting in and out of vehicles faster, but it makes the game a little bit more amusing. at least in my opinion. Now, in terms of its health bar, I think they went in a direction that detracts from the game. Instead of having one long health bar, you get it in segments. You can heal those segments, but if it goes past a certain segment, you can't heal past whatever segment it currently is in. At least not in battle. Outside of battle, it will heal past that point. But it felt like when they made this decision, they didn't really consider repercussions of what that meant in terms of combat for the player, and didn't really add a way outside of one way to earn or get some of that health back. So I know I said melee attacks are pretty useless, and I'll say the basic melee attacks and melee weapons are pretty useless. You do build up a ability that pretty much one-shots most enemies. And sometimes you get perks from doing these attacks. They're usually a sort of bit of animation that shows the character doing something special. And this is the main source of glitching that I had when I played. And this particular move is called a flourish. It's very fancy. You'll do some weird attacks here and there, and some of it's kind of a jokey kind of tone. And they try and balance it out with a meter that fills up during combat, which you can get a perk that keeps it perpetually filled outside of using the skill itself. But this flourish is the only way to get health back when you are damaged in combat, that is. And it felt like they could have, what I said earlier, balanced it out by having something in the game that allowed you to refill your health during combat. And I mentioned this on my rant, is that they had freckle bitches. They call it FB now. For whatever reason, they want to censor themselves, which I covered last time. But they could have had that in the game so that you had items from freckle bitches and then used it to heal yourself in combat like they had in 2. I don't know why they got rid of it in 3 and 4 and why they didn't bring it back for the Saints Row Reboot. It was a lost bit of opportunity as far as I was concerned, and something to make the gameplay just a little bit better. Which brings me to the AI. I already ranted about this in my first impressions, but I'm going to bring it up again, in that the AI is way too accurate. Like, super laser point accurate. It was like that in Saints Row 3 and 4, and you think they would have tried something to make it so they weren't, but they didn't. It's virtually the same. In any case, they didn't balance out their accuracy with the amount of damage they do, which is part of the problem I have with the health bar, and only being able to heal certain segments of it inside of combat. And for the most part, the AI behaves very similar to previous versions. There's no advancement of any kind. They stand there and shoot. Now, there are times in which they'll do this weird sort of twirling juke, which is straight out of Saints Row 4 at the very least, probably 3, and I have footage I could show you to prove that they do the exact same thing in 4 and the reboot, which sort of reinforces my idea this is just Saints Row 4 engine, or a very similar engine. But the weird thing is, they sort of take cover as well, but when more and more AI appear on the screen, they just become dumber and dumber, and they just stand there and shoot at you. So instead of balancing the numbers out with how smart the AI are and how accurate they are, they just decided to throw numbers at you and call it good. And that's where the difficulty is dealing with their super accuracy and the sheer number of them that come in. Now, all 3 factions, would say 4, we'll count the police, behave very similarly in that you do enough damage to them, you kill them off and you get their attention, in which case it builds up to escalating proportions of them coming in wave after wave after wave, and in more numbers, eventually leading to a special unit appearing. And some of these are actually really imbalanced in comparison to the other special units in the game. Like the Panteros, it's a giant, really tall woman with a sledgehammer. And she's pretty much just a joke in comparison to the others. Mainly because she's wielding a melee weapon and it's easy to get away from her. On the other hand, Marshall has a very overpowered special unit. It's basically a guy in a mech suit with a cowboy hat on, and you have to wait for him to use ammo on you. Let's repeat that. You have to wait for him to use ammo on you, so you have to intentionally pretty much get shot at. In this case, just get shot before he pops up these two sort of green cylinders that you have to destroy and then shoot him in his weak spot in his back. Otherwise, you cannot damage this character. But once you get rid of this special character, you get a notoriety clear completely, which is nice. It's something they took from Saints Row 4 with the Wardens. Maybe a little bit more expanded upon it because they don't get rid of all the extras when this unit appears, but it's definitely nice. There are other ways to keep it from escalating as well, and that's by keeping them from calling reinforcements. So a character in the game will have a symbol above their head indicating that they're calling for reinforcements. If you can disrupt them before it fills the circle, you stop them from getting reinforcements. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work correctly. Like I said, that auto-aiming, when you're trying to aim for that guy in the back making the call, it automatically switches to someone who's in the front instead of the guy making the call, screwing you over. There have also been cases where I have killed the guy, reinforcements still showed up, and the ironic thing is when they showed up, I had 3 different groups. One person from each of those groups also made a call. And it basically didn't just triple, it quadrupled. It basically multiplied the number of enemies on the field by 9. It was just absolutely covered in martial enemies. Or NPCs in this case, not enemies, but whatever. And there was no way to win in that case. And I did die from that. And that's one of the main ways I died in this game was due to the overwhelming number of enemies that can be called. And I might add before I get too far, in some cases, some of these enemies will spawn just on the very outside of, I guess, a ring around the player, and you cannot get to them because of the sheer distance between you and them. Your weapons will not lock onto them, and you cannot attack and get that hit in. And like I said, it lacks that sort of free floating aiming that is in Saints Row 3 and 4, which would have allowed me to do that, but this one, it's so rigid that the auto-aim makes me target something I don't want to, much to the detriment when it comes to this particular scenario. It doesn't come as bad later in the game when you get better equipment and as you advance your guns, but when you're first initially playing, it is definitely a obstacle you have to sort of either negate or learn to deal with in some shape or form. I think the best way to describe the combat in this game is something I'm going to use from one of my favorite YouTubers, Grimbeard, and his review of Messiah. Its combat is tough to get used to, and when you do get used to it, it doesn't mean that it's good or anything. It just means you're not as infuriated by it as much anymore. Something along those lines. I'll post his video in the description. But that line more or less describes the combat in this game. It's not good, and there is a learning curve to it, and I don't particularly find it engaging, which is kind of a problem considering the nature of the game is conflict between criminal organizations, the police and the marshals, which, let's face it, they're a criminal organization in their own right. So when it comes to the driving in the game, they changed settings from a closed city with streets with maybe some open space here and there to a very much open world game with plenty of open space, particularly because it takes place in a arid region, if not a desert area. And the cars handle really well in comparison to what they've done in the past. That being that the cars have always pretty much handled well, at least in 3 and 4. And some vehicles are definitely more desirable than others for obvious reasons due to performance, but at least they got that right with certain vehicles not being able to perform as well as others, with the exception of when an AI drives it. So something else they kind of borrowed from GTA is when you're being chased by NPCs, it's not just the police, it's not just other gang members. You could piss somebody off by accidentally sideswiping them, and they'll come after you in their own car. For whatever reason, whenever you're being chased, you could have the fastest car with nitrous and everything, be zooming along, going along the road with non-stop nitrous. You slow down because you're like, oh, I lost them. No. They'll catch up to you in a split second, and in some cases they'll just keep up with you without even using nitrous. It's something that baffles me that they do, is that they can keep perfect track of you regardless of the distance, or keep up with you regardless of the speed and what vehicle they're using. Literally had a guy in a tiny little sedan that I've driven before, not nearly as fast as the car I had, and he caught up instantly, chased me down out in the middle of nowhere because I accidentally clipped him. And something else they do that originated in GTA, but has also made its way into the Saints Row series, is spawning police cars in front of you. It's not as bad in GTA 5, but in previous iterations, yes, they'll just spawn them in front of you and it's really hard to get away. And this, it's really bad because, like I said, they're using an older engine, so they'll literally spawn cars right in front of you. You can see them phase in and you have no chance of not hitting them, and you'll slam into them as you're trying to run away from cops without being able to run away from the cops. That's my biggest detractor from the vehicles in this game, or at least when it comes to driving. Otherwise, it's pretty good. I do like the modifications that they have in this game. It's very similar to pretty much any other car modification, but they added something in this game where you can add different kits, and you can add an off-road kit to vehicles that usually wouldn't have it. So I took a performance sports car, supercar, put a off-road kit on it, and oh, this thing just flies through the desert with an off-road kit. And there's no other vehicle I'd rather use in this game than my Fer-de-Lance with an off-road kit on it. There's some other things that they have that I really don't know why they're in the game or even use, like a tow cable that you can use. Don't know why it's there, but it is. Outside of missions that require it, I never really ever used the cable. It's like they were reaching for something special to add. It doesn't detract, but it doesn't really add to the game, unlike the off-road kit. The one thing I wish they sort of get right, this is both GTA and Saints Row, is that vehicles that are more massive, as in they have more mass, would easily push cars out of the way. In Saints Row, they kind of just smash them. I kind of guess they have that in GTA 5 with the semi-trucks with the cones on the front that just push everything out of the way. But in this, it doesn't really make a difference if you're not using a large vehicle that can crush another vehicle. It doesn't take mass into consideration or speed. One tiny little vehicle can just as easily stop you as a giant vehicle. Which I guess I'll switch now to the perks in the game. So unlike in previous games where you accumulated money and you were able to buy these perks using whatever cash you earned, you get perks from doing challenges. Or I should say, you unlock perks by doing challenges. On top of that, you really can't equip as many, and there aren't as many in comparison. Not to mention they're much more complex, I guess is the best way to put it. More in line with different parts of gameplay. So like I stated before, you have flow, which is a meter that allows you to fill up and allows you to use your special move, the flourish. I have a perk that keeps me from losing flow so that I can pretty much just use it constantly or as soon as I have enough flow to be able to activate it. And I'm not sure why, but they made dual wielding smaller weapons a perk. Don't know why that just wasn't built into the game, but they made it a perk. You kind of get the point what I'm getting with there. There's also different levels of perk. You get some basic perks, and then you go up to a different tier that They do more for you, and then they have one tier where you get one perk that you get to choose from. It's actually kind of refreshing because in Saints Row 3, you could basically become a god, but the only thing that damages you are melee attacks. Not even gunfire or explosions will kill you in Saints Row 3 if you have all the perks. But that was somewhat the appeal of the game, was becoming this badass that could take anything. And that was in general towards the end of the game, or it's something you could do after you beat the game. So this leads me to the challenges that I mentioned earlier. The challenges are basic things that you do in the game. Let's say popping a wheelie for so long, or doing stunts in a certain part of the city. Those unlock challenges, or killing enemies. One of them was running over vehicles in a tank, or killing a marshal with an ambulance. I mean, member of the marshal organization, not like a state marshal. Let's get that clear. I really don't think it matters because you're killing cops anyways, but whatever. So unfortunately, this is also why I think the game engine is very similar, if not the same thing, to Saints Row 4 Reelected. And that some of these challenges, credit is not counted, regardless of how much you try to get them. And some of them are just really tedious and pointless. Like spending so much airtime in a certain vehicle in a specific part of the map. It just gets really boring. I don't know if they thought you would just love the game so much that you wouldn't have a problem going from vehicle to vehicle, unlocking these abilities or completing these challenges. Now let's just talk about the map itself and the activities that you have on it. I'll split it into two categories: business related and non-business related. The business related activities are those directly related to the various ventures that you can invest money in to set them up. The other ones are sort of tied to the story in which you did them in order to earn money to pay rent. These are particularly like riding shotgun, or when you use a helicopter to steal things, or when you use the wingsuit to disable communication towers, I guess. You can earn some kind of reward to them. I think they go towards unlocking challenges so you can get more perks. I'm not entirely sure. But other than earning points for perks, you really don't affect your gameplay overall for that. And anyone who saw my first impressions of the game, the riding shotgun activity is on the terrible side. Poorly thought out, terribly balanced, except for in some areas where they do balance it out of the computer's favor and in yours. But in some cases, you just get wailed on, regardless of how good of a shot you are. And on top of having to climb in and out of the vehicle, which can take a while, you can easily get your vehicle destroyed climbing back into it, or die climbing out of it. The rest aren't really worth speaking about. I mean, there's one where you act as a smuggler, in which you get to from point A to point B, sometimes evading cops. There's stealing stuff with the helicopter, like I said before. But other than maybe some money off to the side, which becomes superfluous later, considering how much you can earn, on top of maybe some points towards earning different perks, there's no real point to them. They aren't particularly fun, and in some cases you have to play them over and over again due to the time constraints of some of the activities. Let's take the wingsuit ones, for example. They give you a really short window and you have to do certain things like attack from air using the wingsuit. Now it takes a really long time to take one guy down, go up, get back into the air, circle back around, and then hit another guy. You can't just go from point A to point B and get them all, because they have so many that require you to do in order to earn that sort of benchmark. And in some cases, there aren't enough characters in these areas in order to do all of them. So you needed to get like 10 wingsuit kills. But then you need to get like 8 melee kills. There aren't enough guys, so you have to do it over again, this time focusing on the melee kills. It felt like a cheap way to get replayability out of it, not because it was fun, but to earn these benchmarks in order to get more points to unlock more perks. Now, they didn't quite do what they did in the last several Saints Rows, where they had collectibles scattered throughout the map. Like the graffiti sprays, where you spray the saints on the side of the buildings, or you collect the sex dolls and other things like they had in Saints Row 3, or even the CDs. They had drug drops from one airplane, and that was it. They're scattered all over the place, but that's all they do. It's just one single thing. It's not a bunch of things, and it's sort of like they wanted to do something similar, but they didn't want to do what other overworld games have and just make it a big, huge tour, getting all these different items scattered throughout the map randomly. Except they kind of still did that, just not to the same degree. So this brings me to the business activities. These are tied to the story. Once you complete a certain amount of them, you go to the final part of the game where you face off against the Wanali. And getting the deeds to these properties are just as questionable as how you got the church, because they got them the same way. They were in the same briefcase. Makes no sense. Besides that, some of these actually do make some form of sense when you unlock them and put them together. Let's take the dojo, for instance. It's responsible for protection money, but it's also responsible, in terms of a narrative, for training up your gang members on how to fight. Functionally, in game, it doesn't actually do that. It just sets up activities. And unfortunately, it's like they looked at previous Saints Row and said, how can we pay homage to previous Saints Row games with these activities? So back to the dojo. In this case, it's the brawl from Saints Row 2, where you got into a ring and fight each other. Or not each other, other prisoners, whatever, gang members, depending on what situation it is. Here you go to other, businesses, and you fight the different gangs that are offering protection. They do give you a weapon, but like I said, the melee combat is just garbage in this game. And because of the perks I had, I was able just to spam one special ability. It's like the Flaming Fist, which came from Saints Row 3. And I was able to win that way. It just wasn't fun, though, in any shape or form. And almost all the activities have this in common. And I'm going to rip on it again, but they have gym robs, which is an anagram for rim jobs, which they should have just kept. I think the people who made this game didn't understand exactly why Saints Row was popular. Part of that was the absurdity / inappropriateness of it. They have you boosting cars, but instead of either randomly coming across them or going to specific parts and finding them, they just tell you exactly where they are. On top of that, there's no boosting cars afterwards. Like, there's no earning extra money from maybe taking certain cars and turning them in for cash. And this one actually had one of my second least favorite parts in the game, and that was stealing the go-kart, because they decided to give you a 3-star rating for stealing a go-kart. And the go-kart can't take a hit worth a damn. And I wish I recorded it, but this thing could not withstand the beating from the police, no matter how many times I tried. I eventually did get it, but I had to get out and kill all the cops in order to get the go-kart in at least a decent enough shape to get it back to the shop. It just felt like another scenario they didn't really think out at all, and it kind of ruined the experience of the game. So there's also a couple of other businesses I kind of wanted to go over. They have a waste management business where you take the toxic waste and you take it to your waste management business, and then after you set it up, they're basically blackmailing the businesses for handling the toxic waste. The side effect is that there's this obnoxious number of trucks with toxic waste bins around the city, and on top of that, the whole scenario is just kind of garbage to me, because one can gets popped open and it'll cause all the other cans to start popping open, and you have to race to the site to get it in there, otherwise you don't get any money. But the whole logic behind it is kind of bullshit in my opinion. And again, it kind of conveys that they didn't really think it out when they made the situation. Now they actually brought back Let's Pretend. They didn't even try and hide it. It has all the costumes and stuff like that. I mean, you can pretty much get the same things in Let's Pretend in other shops for the most part. But you can buy stuff there as well as set it up as a heist headquarters, which is supposed to train your gang members how to do heist. This is also a lost opportunity because after the setup, it's just done. There aren't any more heists after that. Then there was the fabric manufacturer. This one I thought was going to be something practical, and unfortunately it wasn't. It just gives you some really fancy looking patterns you can put on your clothing. Don't get me wrong, they're, how should I put it? On a technical level, really neat, I guess, is the best way to put it. But in terms of practical use, I thought they could have better utilized this building or this gameplay aspect in a different way, such as making it so that your clothing could reduce damage, kind of like John Wick 2 and his suit. Doesn't stop it entirely, but it reduces it. And you can buy different fabric types for, let's say, melee or bullets or explosion or fire, whatever. You get the point. Nope, it's just really fancy color patterns. Now, some of the other businesses do actually just end up rewarding you perks. Let's say the R&D one, where you hire a former Marshall R&D developer. It gets you ability to open up, I guess, an energy field that allows you to shoot through walls, which is neat, and it makes the game a lot easier. It also adds a toy that's like a football that you can throw and attaches to people and sends them flying. You also get a hoverboard, which is just dumb and kind of awkward to use, so I never bothered using it. The radio tower has some practical use in that it increases the amount of time it takes for them to call in reinforcements. On top of that, in terms of the game, it doesn't really make sense because it's radio. But they're supposed to try and help control the story / narrative behind the Saints. I mean, it's radio. It's 2022. I mean, I guess there's still some form of radio, but I don't even bother listening to it anymore, in my car at least. I can't speak for anybody else, but in my car, I listen to my music on my phone. I would say overall, a lot of these businesses were kind of on the pointless side, other than earning you cash after you got them. One in particular I failed to mention is when you have to progress the story, you have to build the Dustmoot Castle with Eli. It serves no purpose other than to push the story forward, along with the Dustmoot side mission, I guess. And it somehow earns you cash. It felt like they underutilized some of these businesses. They could have expanded upon the gameplay more than what they did, than just having repeatable activities like they did in previous Saints Row games. They weren't even as fun as previous Saints Row games. At least in the previous Saints Row games, I would go back and do some of these because they were fun. This one, it was just get them done because they're annoying. So in terms of, I guess, of a conclusion that I'm going to come to, is that this game was definitely not ready for release. That's for sure. Along with some underutilization of some activities, along with having activities that just were pointless, such as having the Castle Sandy Kraken, terrible melee combat, subpar gunplay in comparison to previous Saints Row. This game was just a big disappointment all around. I wish it could stop at the story, but no, they messed up the gameplay overall. It was entertaining, but it's not something I would have bought if I had known it was going to be this sort of mundane. And like I said before, it's clear they didn't quite understand why people like the Saints Row series. and completely and totally failed to recapture that in any shape or form. And unfortunately, I don't know if Saints Row can recover from this, especially due to their habits of not even updating the game. It received maybe one or two, and I've tried going back to it, seeing if some of the stuff works, and it doesn't, even at this point, several months after the game came out. I have had co-op work once, and I've tried playing it with my one friend a couple of times, but we can only get it to work once. And that's one of the biggest disappointments in terms of this game, is not having co-op work. I might have had a little bit more fun playing this game with a friend, but in terms of this, it is just a huge disappointment that they couldn't even get that going for it. People say it's like Cyberpunk 2077. It reminds me kind of more of a median between Cyberpunk and Halo Infinite. I can't speak for the recent update they had to Cyberpunk. What you say before that Cyberpunk? Let's get that clear. But unfortunately, it does fall into that category of it's not really worth buying. Maybe worth playing if it's on Xbox Game Pass or the equivalent for PlayStation. I'm doubting that'll ever happen. But if it does, go ahead, give it a play. Otherwise, I would not waste your money on this. So, if you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. Have a good one.